It's not only that we don't get to see other people we know and love. It's also that we don't get to be seen by other people we know and love. On my Twitter feed this past week, someone posted, "I think being seen less, literally being seen less by other people, instigates a crisis of the self." I heard a guy say that now that movies and theatres and restaurants have been open, but we still are not allowed to go and visit our friends and family, he was saying next time he goes to the movies and he gets to the box office and the person at the counter says, "What have you come to see?" he's going to say, "My mom and my dad." We have this crazy Old Testament story this week. Abraham and Sarah have been promised that they will have a child. But as they reach old age, they give up on that promise. They give up on God's hope, as it were, on what God has said would happen. And so they decide to take matters into their own hands, and they do what wasn't an entirely uncommon practice of the day. They arrange for themselves a surrogate. And without having all the IVF and fertility treatments that we're familiar with today, they turn to one of their slaves, to an Egyptian woman by the name of Hagar. And Abraham sleeps with her, and she indeed falls pregnant. Now, just because this kind of thing wasn't entirely uncommon doesn't mean it isn't complicated. And so Sarah ends up making life really impossible and difficult for Hagar. And she decides to flee the camp. She doesn't like this role of being the other woman, and she disappears. And then as she runs away, God interrupts her escape. And that for me too is fascinating, that God would do that, but we move on. God tells Hagar to go back to that toxic environment, go back to Abraham and Sarah. And he says to her in that moment, he encourages her, and he says to her that you are going to bear a son. This child you're carrying will be a boy. And God goes on to say that he's going to grow into being an ass of a man. I quote in the Bible. Some translations say to a wild donkey of a man. And then God further goes on to say that she must call this son Ishmael. And Ishmael means God hears. And then Hagar does something interesting. She herself, almost in response to God naming her child, she gives God a name. And she's the first person in the Judeo-Christian scriptures to name this God whom we worship. And she calls God El Roi, the God who sees. So we have this lovely, almost antiphonal thing going on here. God says, "I will call your child." God hears. And Hagar responds with, "And I will call you the God who sees." So Hagar does return to Abraham and Sarah, and there she gives birth to Ishmael. In the meantime, God has been faithful to his promise to Abraham and Sarah, and they conceive and bear a child and name him Isaac. And now our scripture for today says that on the day that Isaac was weaned from his mother, Sarah thinks that Ishmael, she interprets some gesture or action on the part of this child. She sees it as a mocking gesture. And it becomes like the final straw. All the tensions of this awkward family blow up. And Sarah eventually decides that's it. And Hagar and Ishmael must be gone and must be banished forever. And this is understandably distressing for Abraham. We're not told in what way it particularly is, but one could imagine even if he wasn't particularly distressed on behalf of Hagar, he certainly would have been distressed on behalf of his firstborn son, Ishmael. And then for me, this already difficult story is made more complicated by the fact that the scripture tells us that God tells Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. He says Abraham mustn't be perturbed by this turn of events. And that for me is troubling, just because we know what the intent is. To send them away is really a death sentence. But God says to Abraham he mustn't worry, and in my own paraphrase, God assures Abraham that everything is going to work out fine. And in fact, that's not what happens at first. Things don't work out fine. What happens is what one would expect because Hagar and Ishmael get sent off into the desert with just a little bit of water and a little bit of food. And as we know, the desert is an unforgiving place. And very soon the water and food run out, and the inevitable has to be faced. And so Hagar takes her little child, now dehydrated and hungry. She takes her little child and places him under a bush, and then deliberately positions herself close enough to be near him, but far enough away so she cannot see him die. So there's that word again for her. She cannot see him die, and I assume she wouldn't want to hear him die either. In fact, our scripture today tells us that she says, I cannot watch the boy die. And so she begins to sob, and the boy begins to cry. And in the midst of their tears, a voice comes from heaven to Hagar that says, do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying. And there's that word, hear. God hears. That's the boy's name. God hears. And it's those two words that I wanted us to spend just a brief moment with on this Sunday morning. I wanted us to hear those words, seeing and hearing. The gospel reading for today are the words of Jesus for a persecuted church. They are words for people who are in trouble. They are words for people under economic pressure, under economic threat, even under potentially economic demise. They are for people living in fear of their lives probably every day. They are for people affected by violence. They are for people living under constant uncertainty. And in this part of the gospel set aside for us, Jesus offers the early church, and I know it's not the right word, but let me just use it today, offers three strategies, if you like, for facing for facing severe trouble. And I've only, because of the limits of this thing, I'm only going to look at one of those three things today. And I want to ask you to consider it carefully with me. Many of you will know this to be true about me, but I'm always nervous when speaking to suffering people, when speaking to people who are enduring significant trouble. I always am nervous about using words or ideas that are trite. I never want to be so disrespectful to people as to offer them bumper sticker solutions to what are really life-changing troubles, even life-threatening troubles. We are all obligated to be cautious in how we speak to one another when others are in trouble. So I pay careful attention that Jesus would say these words to people facing real troubles. That Jesus would say these words to terrorized, fearful, uncertain people. Listen to what he says. He says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. And even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows." Jesus is saying this will be your strength in this time of trouble. This will be your strength, that you know that you are seen, and if I can add, and that you are heard, but that you will know that you are seen. This will be your strength, that you will remember that you are deeply valuable to God. Knowing that you are seen, and knowing that in your being seen, you are valuable to God, that will hold you in times of great trouble. I find Richard Rohr's observation very helpful when he says, "Do not get rid of your hurts until you have learned all that they have to teach you." And he goes on to say then that we shouldn't deny our pain, we shouldn't try and beat our pain, Neither fight nor flight are appropriate in this moment. He says when we encounter pain, we must hold it until it transforms us. And I think he might be right. I think that might be something of what Jesus is saying to us today. As the first disciples of Jesus confronted just wave after wave of trouble, he gives them a simple picture. And it's the picture of a little bird. And God says to them, God knows about that little bird. And therefore he knows much, much more about you. And Jesus never promises them the removal of the trouble. He just offers them this deep assurance that in their trouble they are seen and heard, that they hold the trouble, and as they hold it, they are seen and they are heard. So after Hagar hears God's voice from heaven, saying that she must now go to her dying son, whom she left under the bush, and she must lift him up, we are then told in verse 19 that God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. The two big interventions in Hagar's life happen when she firstly understands that God sees her, and when she understands that God hears her. So when I read this passage of Scripture in preparation for today, I wondered, how was it that Hagar missed that well of water that God reveals to her at the end of the story? It seems to have been quite nearby. How is it that she didn't see it? And then I thought maybe it is that when we come to know, when we deeply understand that God sees us and that God hears us, that we will, maybe not immediately, but we will come to know and to see that near all of us, in our troubles, there is indeed a well of water. God bless you today. God go with you.